for those of you who are visual, this is just to reiterate that. One of the things I did want to mention is that when I started doing this executive resume writing, I was basically just out of college. There's a few key fundamental things that you need to know in order to rewrite executive resumes, but the good thing is you guys are all University of Chicago graduates. You're all really smart, and I can teach this to you, and that's the reason that I don't do this full-time anymore. There's a lot of places out there that will rewrite your resume for like $50, and in 1 or 2 hours of lessons, I can teach you to do the same thing, and so now I just do this as a volunteer, and it's not my full-time job anymore, but hopefully I can share some of that experience with you as well. First, I'd like to explain my philosophy on resumes. The only purpose of a resume is to get you an interview. A lot of people feel like there's a lot of pressure to get the resume really, really perfect, and they stress out a lot about it. And I don't believe that's the case at all. Really, the resume is sort of a gatekeeper, and as soon as you've gotten the interview, what matters is the impression that you make on people face-to-face. And so I'm going to be coming at all of this from that perspective. I'm just trying to get a resume. Through the recruiter or through the computer so that I can get an interview and then I can make a great impression face-to-face. So how do we get past the recruiter? There's actually been a lot of research done on this, and sometimes people are surprised when they find out that recruiters on average spend only 6 seconds looking at your resume when they're trying to decide, do I include them or exclude them from the pile of people that I'm passing on to a phone screen. And since they're only spending 6 seconds on your resume, as you can imagine, it doesn't necessarily matter all that much what you say on your resume. What they are mostly looking at is your name, titles and companies, start and end dates, and education. And you can see from the eye map on the right-hand side of the screen that pretty much they're following the big, bold things on the screen. Especially on the right-hand side, you can see that a lot of the time is spent lingering on the things that are capitalized or in big, bold letters, and they're really just skimming down the left-hand side. So when you're thinking about how to structure your resume, this is really important. You know, the recruiters are expecting certain pieces of information to be in certain places on your resume, and if they don't see it there, they're probably going to move on. But if they do see it there and it stands out and it matches vaguely what they're expecting, then you're more likely to move on to the next part. Any additional time in that 6 seconds that's not spent on those 6 things is basically spent looking for keywords that match the position. And generally, because the recruiter does not understand the job you're applying for, they're in HR, they're not in marketing or in sales or in finance or whatever you're applying for, they're really just matching the job description keywords to keywords on the resume that match. And so this is somewhat of a shock to people. They think, oh, they must spend at least 30 seconds or a couple of minutes reading my resume. They really don't. The person who's going to spend that much time on your resume maybe is the hiring manager, but first you need to get past that recruiter. Nowadays we're seeing a lot of times where before a recruiter even looks at your resume, you're actually getting scanned by a computer. And so there's a couple of things you need to do slightly differently if you're focusing on getting through the computer. The first is that version of your resume that works well for the recruiter, where you have things kind of aligned on the left-hand side and you have big capitalization for your titles and job companies and things like that, doesn't work that well on the computer. So I actually recommend having 2 different versions of your resume, one that's in a Word formatted document and one that's in a notepad text version where really you're limited to dashes and capitalization and everything else. And so you actually need to format that resume completely separately when it's being scanned through the computer. Make sure you're sticking with basic fonts. Don't go really small trying to fit more things on the page. Anything that's complicated in terms of formatting, like tables or borders or lines or graphics, make it harder for the computer to scan. There's actually some systems that will completely reject a resume that has like a horizontal line because they think that everything below the horizontal line is like separate from the resume. And so some people use horizontal lines to like break up their sections in their resumes. That's a really bad idea when you're submitting through an online application system. So in general, just try to think really simple, really standard formatting. It doesn't need to look gorgeous. It just needs to be legible by a computer system. So that's kind of tricky. The other big thing that people ask a lot about when they're talking about a computer that's looking at their resume is about keywords, because a lot of what the resume systems are matching on is keywords. The important thing here is that the keywords need to be integrated into the resume. You can't just like create a section at the top of your resume and just throw a bunch of keywords in there. The systems are actually smart enough that they look for this keyword bombing, and they will reject resumes that are doing that. So you need to make sure that you're choosing the most important keywords from those job descriptions, and they're integrated throughout your resume. If you're applying for a job that's very, very similar to the type of work that you've already been doing, then it should be very easy to integrate those keywords into your resume naturally. If you're applying for something that's very, very different, that might take a little bit more effort, but make sure that you're really avoiding sort of those bulleted lists at the top where you're just throwing all the keywords in and all those buzzwords at the top. It needs to make a lot of sense in order for the systems to sort of let you through and see that you are valid to go through to the recruiter, and even for those recruiters as well, that when they sort of scanning, they're not going to just look at that top section for those keywords. They're going to look, is it all the way throughout your resume? Have you been doing those things throughout your career? Obviously, the standard information like former employers and education and years of experience need to be on there as well, because that's another thing that the computer is looking for. If the job description says 10 to 15 years of experience, they're going to be kind of looking at your resume to see, do you have roughly that many years of experience? And if it says that you need to have an MBA, it's going to be looking for that, and those are things that it might exclude you on if you don't include that information. But that's pretty standard, right? We're going to include all of that information on our resume anyway. The other thing is that you want to use simple language. Try to avoid acronyms that can be confusing. Try to avoid like a lot of industry jargon. Don't say really convoluted words when you can just use one simple verb, because again, computers aren't that smart, and if you can say something in 2 words instead of 5 words and they have the exact same meaning, that's better. And then I often get the question about length. No matter how long you've been working, your resume should not be more than 1 to 2 pages, and this is very specific to the U.S. obviously, and this is specific to U.S. corporate jobs. I get that question all the time. So when you're applying to positions in Europe or you're applying for an academic position, obviously there's some different expectations there. But when you're applying through a recruiter or a computer system, generally they're expecting 1 to 2 pages. If you're at the C level or senior executive level and they see that your resume only goes back 10 to 15 pages and the very first job listed was a director or manager of something, they're very well aware that that was not the first job you ever had. If they really care, they'll ask you. But generally, something going back further than 10 to 15 years tends not to be that relevant to the work you're going to do in your next position. And so it's perfectly acceptable. It's considered normal in the industry to leave those things off of your resume and just focus on the more recent experience. And that's sort of, if the computer system is sort of going to stop and not look beyond that anyway, right? So they're definitely looking at the most recent 10 years. So a lot of the things that you're looking for a recruiter and the computer are kind of the same. So it's helpful to look specifically at real example resumes, take a look at what are the things we should exclude or include. This is a great resume for my exclude example. So there's a lot of things this person did that I wouldn't do personally. So for example, saying your date of birth right up there on top is a bad idea, because you don't want to offer personal information unless you absolutely have to. You could be considered too old or too young, too experienced, too inexperienced. You never know based on the person that you're going forward, your resume is going to. So it's better just leave that off and only address those things if specifically asked in like a job application. There's no point in putting that directly on your resume. You'll also see here that we have these horizontal lines that we were talking about that are bad for computers, so you want to try to avoid that a little bit as well. You'll also see a fairly lengthy profile section here, and the problem with this profile section is it's actually between the profile and the contact information taking up about the first half of the page. And if you remember the way that the recruiters were looking at the resumes, they're pretty much focused on the first page and all the way on the left side. And so what that means is they're really not getting any of the information they want until all the way on page 2, which is, if you remember, job title, company, dates. All of this information is actually on the second page of that resume. And so they've already looked at the whole first page before they see any of that information they're looking for. So that's generally a really bad idea. You want to try to cut out these profile sections in general, and I'll talk later about a couple of exceptions of when you might want to include a profile, but in general, take them out. We'll also see here that there's fairly extensive descriptions about education, and in most cases when you have several years of work experience, you don't want to go into this much detail in your education. Especially here, you'll notice this is an entire paragraph of text. It's 6 lines long, and no one's going to read it. You just can't read it in 6 seconds. So this is just, again, taking up space, making it harder to get to the meat of what the recruiter is looking for. And then, some of this information here are really detailed about exactly what courses were taken. For most people, that's really way more detail than you want to get to. So now I've already gotten to the bottom of the page, and the only thing I've seen on here that was on my original list is my name. So and my education. So all of the things that the recruiter's looking for, now I have to go to page 2. Then when you get to page 2 and you're looking at, okay, I've got the name of the company. Well, what was my role in this company, right? I was on a street team. What was my role? That's not specified there at all. If you actually read into the paragraph, it would tell you that they became a rep for something. This information is really hard to find. You need to go into like 8 lines of a paragraph. It's really hard to read any of that information because there's no bullets in there, right? So this is, in general, not going to make any sort of impact. Again, 6 seconds, you're just trying to get to the interview. These questions, these things that the recruiter is going to ask, they're not going to go in and read the whole resume to try to figure it out. They're just going to shove this one to the side. And then down here you'll see again we've got interests and activities, a whole paragraph about what do you do in your free time. Not going to be read either. Additional skills, things like I use computers daily and I'm familiar with Microsoft Word and Excel. A lot of those types of skills are sort of presumed at this point. Unless you're in an industry where that really is a distinguishing factor and most people can't do that, generally you want to leave that sort of stuff off because, what if they really wanted somebody who used PowerPoint and you didn't say that you could use PowerPoint on here? It's better to have them come to you later in the interview process and say, hey, we were hoping to find somebody who was really familiar with Microsoft Office. Is that an issue with you? You'd be like, of course, everybody uses Microsoft Office. No problem, right? And then the very last thing that's taking up space on this resume is references available upon request, and that's just assumed. Every job asks you for references at the end or at the beginning or some point in the process. It's not adding any value in the resume. If you look at the resume just as I'm trying to get an interview, then there's a lot of things we could cut off this resume, get this down to 1 page, so that in that 6 seconds we're really directing the recruiter's eyes to the things that are most important. So there's a lot of don'ts on this particular resume. Let's take a quick look at a do. Now this is a person with very similar amount of experience. We're looking at somebody who's a couple years out of college, doesn't have a lot of experience, but able to get most of their stuff onto 1 page in the resume. They have a really good use here of a profile section. So you'll notice that this profile is very specific to this person. They're talking about 5 years of experience with specific software programming languages. They're mentioning their fluency in 2 languages. Those are things that really help this candidate stand out. This is a good use of a profile because maybe this person, otherwise might just seem like any other software developer, but now you're seeing right up front, okay, they've got some specialized skill sets, they've got some language skills. That's a good reason I want to use a profile and stand out from the crowd. And then you'll see that on the left side, they've really done a good job making it clear what were their jobs, what companies did they work for, what were their titles, what were those dates. Remember those things that the recruiter is looking for. It's really easy to find those on this resume. They've also done a really good job within the resume of pulling out bullets, making it really easy to read and follow, so you can just kind of skim and get a good idea that this person, did 3 main things at each of their jobs and what were those. And you can see clear progression from junior programmer to senior software developer, and to a recruiter that says this person's been valued, they've been able to move up at their various companies, this is somebody I want to talk to. They've also, made it really obvious at the bottom where their education is, and you can see that even though this was maybe, 3 or 4 years ago, for this person, they haven't added a lot of detail around the education, but you do see one really important thing, high honors. That's really standing out. Okay, I didn't just get a computer science degree, I did that with high honors and, probably from a fairly good school, even though I don't know much about the University of British Columbia, I'm impressed, right? So in the 6 seconds I spend looking at that, those things really stand out to me, and I say, okay, this person looks like they've qualified, let's move on. Digging in on the right-hand side, I just pulled out one specific bullet, from another resume that I wanted to show, when you're getting past the recruiter and into the hiring manager, then they're going to be starting to look down into the bullets a little bit to try to figure out, you know, not only does this person understand, can they handle the responsibilities of the position, but can they also surpass the expectations. And so the great thing that this person did was this first bullet talks about managing a project all the way through completion. They give you the quantification of that role. So they managed over a $2 million project by themselves. And not only that, they tell you the result. How did that end up? Well, they delivered it on time and $600,000 under budget. Now, that's the very first bullet under this role. If I'm the hiring manager, I'm saying, hey, this guy did a very large project on time, under budget. I want to talk to him. I don't need to read anything more because that's the kind of person I want on my team, right? So just a couple of quick numbers to give a sense of scale, to really sound like I'm owning the project. That's a really great bullet right there. And I don't even need to read any of the other stuff below it, and in fact, I'm probably not going to, right? I just need one piece of evidence to say I want to interview or not interview this person, and that to me says interview. So when you're looking at your resume and you're thinking, okay, now that I know that they're only going to spend 6 seconds looking at the resume and they're mostly looking at superficial stuff I can't change, like my job titles and my dates, what do I even bother doing with the content, right? These are what I consider to be the 4 most important content fixes, and it's really focused on not being excluded in the process, right? It's just about getting the interview and getting through the recruiter. So the first thing is I need to stand out over the other 100 or 1,000 people that have applied for this job. So if any bullet in your resume applies to everybody who's ever had that job, cut it. You need to say, is this what makes me unique in this job? Is this what makes me the best fit for this new job? Why would they want to interview me over all these other people? If it doesn't say that, it shouldn't be on your resume. Because really what you want is to make some outrageous claims or some really impressive claims, always true, of course, but that will make somebody come and ask you in an interview, well, how did you do that? Because I read this on your resume and I want to know, how did you do that? That's what gets you the interview. If you say, oh, I was responsible for managing projects and developing documentation and, you know, proofreading, well, that applies to everybody who has had that job maybe. But if you say, well, you know, I was responsible for proofing, and as a result of proofing, I decreased our cost on reprints by 100%, then that's somebody I want to talk to. Well, how did you do that? Why were you such a much better proofreader than all the other proofreaders, for example? So those are the kinds of statements that you want to keep. Anything that's not like that should just be cut. And kind of leading into that, it's about quantification. It doesn't need to be the most impressive numbers, and in some industries it's really, really hard to come up with numbers. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that later, but whatever you can, explain how much, how many, how often, just to give people a sense of the scale, the responsibility, the change. There's always, almost always, some way to make there be some sort of numbers associated to what you did. Even if it's like a number of people that were impacted or managed, or the amount of change, or how often you did it. I'll show you some examples that I think will make that easier to see. The other thing that is really important is proofreading. It's really important not just that you proofread, but that you have other people proofread your resume. There's nothing that can stop a process short faster than finding a really bad typo in a resume. If you do manage to get someone to read your resume for more than 6 seconds and they run into a spelling error, they're going to say, this person needs a job, and they need a job really badly, and yet they couldn't be bothered to make sure that they spelled all the words correctly on their resume. Is this the kind of person I want in my company who could potentially have a very bad impact if they are careless or they make a mistake in their day-to-day job? And will they care about that more than they cared about their resume, which is their livelihood that's getting them a new job? Probably not, right? That's going to be a really easy way to get rid of somebody from a pile if you have hundreds of resumes to go through. They just look sloppy. So can't reiterate enough how important it is to have other people proofread your resume. And then, of course, when in doubt, you need to cut. Less is more. Attention spans are short. You're only going to get 6 seconds. You need to make sure that in that 6 seconds people are seeing what's most important to you. If you have pages and pages, or you have packed all kinds of stuff in there, you just need to get to the minimum amount of things that are going to get you through the door, to get you on the phone, to get you the interview. If you don't include everything that ever happened to you in your resume, you'll be just like everybody else, but it's really important, just enough to get you the interview. I put a checklist in here, which you can take back with you. These are sort of like the very last couple things I would do when I think my resume is ready. I would have somebody else look at it and say, okay, if I spend 6 seconds, is it easy to read? Did you see what I want you to see in that 6 seconds? And using bullet points and white space is really important to sort of direct the eye to whatever you want. Focusing on accomplishments and using action verbs to be very proactive and sound like somebody I want working at my company, not somebody who has a job responsibility or duty that they do, but somebody that takes the job responsibility and actually goes above and beyond and accomplishes something great for my company. That's the person I want to talk to, right? Making sure you're cutting all the extraneous information, that you have those keywords in there, and that the most important items are at the top, and I would argue even on the left, because that's where those recruiters are looking when they get those resumes, and they're going through hundreds of resumes trying to eliminate people. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of example resumes and maybe make this a little bit more real to see exactly what we would want to include or exclude from these resumes. Now, this guy is a graphic designer and an illustrator, and graphic designers always think that they need to be really creative, and so he has a bunch of things in here that I already told you not to do. He's got a mission statement. He's talking about, he's got a BA, and he's good with Creative Suite and Office Suite, and he's willing to learn, he's ethical and have organizational skills. These are a lot of cliches that everybody says about themselves when they're applying for this type of job. That mission statement is not really adding a lot of value. And then he's got a bunch of, those keyword bombs at the top, and not only are they keyword bombs, but they're in a table, which is really hard for a computer to read. And it's actually even hard for me as a human to read this because of the way that all of the data is organized. We have a lot of different fonts. The stuff I'm expecting to see isn't there. His company is on the left-hand side, but his job title's on the right-hand side. He's got the address for his companies, which I really don't need to know. He's got a lot of that reiterated in here. The dates are kind of in the middle, very hard to see. In general, it's just really hard to read. There's a lot of inconsistency in formatting. If we just simplified this drastically just to be able to read it, I would be able to spend a little bit more time on it. It's very, very hard to read this as it is. And so even though this person is fairly young, you can actually, if you do read it, you can see down here the most relevant work experience to his stated goal of being a graphic designer is all the way at the bottom right-hand corner of his resume, which is that he worked in the graphic design department at his school. Now, if you remember what we said, top and to the left is where the recruiters are looking. If I was a recruiter, I might see Jewel Food Stores and Phoenix Marketing and Staffing Group, and I would say this person has nothing relevant to the job they're applying for. I'm not even going to talk to him, right? Whereas what he really needed to do is get this graphic design department stuff over here at the top, bold, nice and large, talking about how he actually did some of this stuff that he wants to do in his new position. So this is a really good example of what not to do when you're fairly new and you have not a lot of work experience. You don't want to make it even harder and bury the little relevant work experience you do have all the way at the bottom. I like this example because this is sort of similar in the sense that this person, has wasted a lot of space over here. There's a lot of white space in that prime area because they aligned this over here to the left and left all this white. So now if I'm looking in the top left, there's really nothing there. And then when I do look down, dates are nice and big. That's great. Titles, easy to see. Companies, easy to see. The problem is that this raises a big red flag, right? 2013, 2013, 2013. I have 3 jobs in 2013. That's not making me look so good, right? And then if you actually read some of these bullets, they're all really generic, right? I developed content. I proofread. I formatted. That doesn't really sound like a person who did much more than the bare minimum, right? And up here we've got another list, keyword list, kind of taking up space, not really making this person stand out. We'll revisit this later, but this is a kind of example of how you can have a fairly decently formatted resume that is not adding any value in getting you that interview. So you need to think, not just about the formatting, but also about the way that some of these things are being conveyed to the reader when you look at this. This is my sister's resume. I don't like to tell her I use her resume as an example. So my sister felt like her job experience was all over the place. She had sort of changed roles a little bit, and she wanted to go into consulting, which was a new field for her, and she felt like she really needed to have a functional resume. Now, I know there's people on this call probably who have thought about this for themselves, right? I really need a functional resume. Now you look at somebody else's functional resume. It's very, very difficult to see what this person's skill set even is. And remember, the recruiter's looking at title, company, dates. Where are those things on this resume? They're buried all the way down here. Education also buried all the way down here. So now if I'm looking for the things that are bold on the left, I'm getting a bunch of keywords, buzzwords, don't mean a lot, right? Everybody says, oh, business insight, strategic development. What you're missing here is the fact that she was at the American Red Cross and Aramark, and she got promoted at Aramark to become a manager in strategic development, and that she was there for more than 4 years, which in these days is a big plus, right? These are the things that the recruiters care about, and it's totally buried in that resume. So I want to spend a little bit of time, since I actually did rewrite her resume, and let's dig into a couple of examples of how do we rewrite this resume to get her a job. So on the top is the very first bullet that was on her resume. She's talking about she managed research projects. Basically, she managed the entire research project, right? So I asked my sister, okay, I've got a bullet here, and I don't understand what you do. And it's odd because we're in kind of the same field. Like, we're both in sort of marketing strategy. But when I read this, I really don't understand. Can you talk to me in plain English? What did you actually do, right? She says, well, you know, we did a survey. I'm like, okay, survey. How many people did you survey? Now I've got an action, right? I did 250,000 surveys, right? Why did you do the survey? Well, we were trying to figure out if people were satisfied with Aramark. Well, I can tell you right now they're not satisfied with Aramark. Okay, so what did you do when you got the survey results, right? Well, you know, we increased our performance a little bit from 34 to 40%, right? Now, my sister's not responsible for the fact that people are unhappy with Aramark. What she did do was she did a survey, right? And the survey is a pretty big scale, and that managed to have a measurable impact on their customer satisfaction, right? Because they were able to take that and there were actionable insights. Now, I didn't say in this bullet that my sister specifically by herself did all of this, right? She didn't necessarily increase the performance rating by herself, but that's the impact that that had on the business. That's something that a company looks at and says, yes, I want to do that. What's the other thing that you notice about this bullet that you don't notice about the top bullet? Well, you know what? When you write numbers in text, the numbers actually are taller than all the words around them, so they stand out more. And same thing with percent signs, right? So they sort of jump out at you right away when you're looking at this bullet, and nothing really jumps out at you right away in that top bullet. So it's just the virtue of adding numbers draws my attention to the scale of 250,000 and the result of 34 to 40%. Looking at the next one, right? Developing and initiating deployment of platforms to facilitate employee engagement. Okay, what does that mean? Well, they had Microsoft Link, and they wanted to prove that if you had Microsoft Link, which is like an IM platform for those who don't know, people would adopt Microsoft Link and they would be happier, right? So I asked my sister, well, you know, what happened? She's like, well, actually the proof of concept didn't really go anywhere. We never adopted it fully. I'm like, that's okay. That's not your fault. Why don't you tell me, like, how'd the proof of concept itself go? She said, well, actually, you know, like half of the people that were in our pilot group adopted. Okay, 50% adoption, that's pretty good. That's a number. It may not be the most impressive number, but if you've ever been in charge of change management, it's a pretty impressive number. And she had a count of how many instant message sessions had happened over 3 months. Now, she didn't have this off the top of her head. When I asked her these questions, she had to go back and look it up, right? But she did. She looked it up, and, you know, okay, that's a pretty decent amount. So, you know, 500 people adopted it, and they generated 2,800 instant messaging sessions over 3 months. Now, this is a much more tangible bullet to understand as a person who's not in that space. When you're looking at a recruiter or maybe a high-level manager who's not down in the details, or if, like my sister, you're looking to switch into consulting, the consulting manager probably has never implemented Microsoft Link. They don't know anything about, you know, adoption at Aramark, but they can see okay, I understand an enterprise communication tool, I understand adoption, I understand that there was a fairly decent amount of pilot users, that there was a 3-month scale, right? So this is something I can understand even if I don't, I'm not involved in this in my day-to-day business, right? There's some clear language here, there's some tangible numbers to it. This is what her resume looked like after we were done going through this for every one of her bullets. And I won't lie, this does take time, especially because her resume had so little meat to it beforehand. But you'll notice that there's a major formatting change here, right? We're looking at the left-hand side. You see her company names really big, capitalized, bold. That's because my sister's company names are recognizable. She worked for big companies, big nonprofits like the Red Cross and Aramark. And we've de-emphasized her title a little bit. They're a little bit smaller because, you know, it wasn't as relevant to what she was looking to do. But we do show that she was in these roles for a while. She got promoted at her current company. The titles are still sort of the first couple things you look at. It's really easy to find the education. It's really easy to find the years. Those are sort of hitting all those bullets of what the recruiter is looking for. Then at the bottom, you'll notice we have some professional associations. We're showing that not only was she, you know, really involved in work in some organizations, but she also founded an extra organization at her company. So that's something that's really making her stand out above and beyond maybe some of these other people. And to give you some results, my sister actually no longer works at Aramark. She's now a consultant at KPMG. So she was successful in transitioning into consultants, and I think part of the reason is because it was very clear that looking at this resume that she led a lot of projects, a lot of pilots in all kinds of different areas like knowledge management and social media and things like that that were very analogous to the kind of work that she would be doing as a consultant. And by changing her resume from functional to chronological, we were actually able to make it more obvious to the hiring manager what the kind of work she was doing, right, in strategy that was relevant to consulting. And that was really hard to tell in the previous version of her resume. So, just checking the time here.
Kristen,
Yep.
Kristen, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We've received a couple of questions, so just wanted to break in with one or two, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is, what if you've been out of the job market for the past 15 years and you're trying to go back to your old type of work? Do you address this at all in the resume? Do you have to find a way to show that what you've done in all of those years, but your past experience might be more relevant?
That's a great question. I actually have a slide coming up on that, so if you don't mind, I'll table that one for the moment.
Absolutely. And then if I can just break in with one more, relating to what you were saying earlier, if somebody is submitting an application through an online portal, should they also only go back 10 to 15 years in that application process?
So it depends on what they're asking for. When you're submitting online through a job application, you need to give them exactly what they ask for. So generally, they'll ask for like your last three work positions. Unless they explicitly say that you need to list every job you've ever had, you don't need to list every job you've ever had. Usually they don't ask that much. If they do ask for you to list everything you've ever had, then you do need to do that. But it's typically the last 3 is what it will say.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Sure. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a couple of examples, and I don't have a lot of time to dig into these, but hopefully you'll get the slides and you can take them home. So this is an example of an individual who's actually really impressive. He basically ran the Hong Kong Mercantile Exchange. The problem with his resume was there was so much information in this, it was really hard to even tell what was happening, and there was no hierarchy in the resume at all. This is actually pretty much what it looked like, this section of the resume. Everything was the same size. So visually, because there's so much material and it's all the same size, I don't know where to look, right? Remember, 6 seconds, you need to really make it obvious for them. So this is kind of roughly what it ended up looking like when we revamped it. You'll notice that we made the title and the company really stand out as well as the years, and we actually cut back a lot of the things that he said he did at his previous job, and we're really focusing on the things that were unique about him, the fact that he set up electronic commerce, commodities trading in Asia Pacific, and that was 1 million contracts within 2 years. That's a really impressive number. This guy is impressive to begin with, right? But he just wasn't making any traction because he had too much stuff going on in his resume. talking about the fact that they were, really managing Chinese and international relations there, interacting with all these different groups. Those are things that are really important for a C-level job. And really by the fact that we were, kind of drastically cut back what he did, or what we say he did in that 3 years, we were able to sort of focus their attention on the things that made him the most unique. Obviously, no one who's reading this resume is going to think that those are the only 3 things he ever did when he was a president, but we are kind of helping them by selectively focusing on the things we think are most important. Looking at this one, you notice this is actually a pretty good format for the resume. There's some good visual hierarchy. There's not, sometimes when I look at stuff like this and I'm like, okay, I want to rewrite this, but there's not a lot. This guy's already got numbers in here. He's already got, good spacing and so forth. So how do you change this to make it better or whatnot? This is sort of what we're looking at. Now, again, focusing on aligning on the left side to make it a little bit easier to read, and then bringing those 3 sections into bullets and really just shortening them, getting the same message across in a much tighter, compact space. So now it looks like there's actually a lot more numbers here. There's no more numbers here than there were before. It just looks like there's a lot more numbers because there's less text surrounding all the numbers. So just to compare back again, you see here like there was 15K, 5K, 4K, 440,000. But there, see, it kind of seems like there's like 1 or 2 numbers per bullet, except each of these is like 2, 3, 4 lines. So when you look at this one, now it looks like, okay, we've got a number per line basically, right? It just feels like there's a lot more meat to it, like it's a more substantial contribution, even though we're really not saying anything different. All we've done is sort of align things a little bit more to the left and simplify the language to get a much more concise, clear view that to, again, a third party, right, is about making sure it's understandable even if you aren't in that industry or that space and you're trying to make a decision about this person. Now, the fact that he, saved a customer relationship and that actually saved the company almost 200 grand a year, generated additional revenue, that's very tangible impact, somebody that I want to have in my company. Again, this is another one here where we see, it's just wall of text kind of thing, paragraphs. It's really hard to tell. This guy actually, manages global teams. He knows a lot about the hardware market in Asia. He ran the company's offices in Japan. It's really hard to see that because there's almost too much information here. So this guy has some really impressive experience, very unique, but it's sort of buried in paragraphs and paragraphs. And I know because when I'm rewriting them, I'm the only one who has to read them, right? Nobody else ever reads those things, but I read them. So we're really focusing here on the fact that now it's very clear that this guy ran their Japanese office and was then promoted to run all of their worldwide accounts because we've actually split those out into 2 different titles. And you could tell from first glance at that job that this guy was actually promoted when his company was acquired. And then we're focusing again on numbers, like the value of the contracts. He won $49 million in contracts with Sony and Samsung and Sanyo. Those are big names. That's big money, right? This is an important guy. $150 million in additional revenue, Design of the Year award, all kinds of big names. He launched a new subsidiary in Korea. These are all things that we're pulling out of that huge paragraph of text to help us focus on, again, situation, action, results, really focusing on tangible outcomes that help distinguish you from all those other people. Now, I hope I've hammered that point in clear enough because that is where I made my money as a resume writer, right? That's all I did over and over again for every resume I saw was the same thing. And I know that you guys can do this too. And sometimes the easiest way to do this is to give your resume to somebody in your family or a friend who doesn't understand what you do for a living and have them ask you questions until they literally understand what you do for a living. And it's very difficult. Like I try to explain to my mother what I do for a living, and it really forces me to try to be clear and to explain, like, I'm really good at my job, and here's why I'm good at my job. And you don't need to understand my industry. I need to explain it to you until you understand why you'd want to hire me, even if you don't do this. And having that conversation with somebody who's outside of the process really helps you to get away from all that jargon and that feeling like I need to include everything I've ever done. Now, common questions I get. Okay, well, you showed me some great stuff, but that doesn't apply to me because of X, Y, Z. Job hopping. If you have switch jobs a lot, like that person we saw earlier who had 3 jobs in 2013. How do you make that look on your resume so that it doesn't seem like you're switching jobs a lot because of problems with you, right? Sometimes you can summarize those as projects while you were freelancing. So in the case of that person, you know, maybe because it was clear that they were temporary positions and she took them for whatever reason, I can say I was freelancing and I took a couple of temporary positions and they were projects, right? I did consulting for this group or for that group. As long as you're not being really misleading, as long as that can accurately be described as what you were doing. In some cases, you can actually eliminate short-term jobs from your resume if they're not applicable, as long as they're not leaving gaps that would be really unclear, right? So if you, let's say you had a job in 2013 and a job in 2014, and then in between 2013 to 2014 you spent 4 months doing something, if you just have years on your resume and you can put, you know, your long job and, you know, your 2 long jobs on the resume with the years, you can kind of eliminate that job in between that you didn't stay at very long from the resume if it's not applicable and it's not causing any, you know, questions or confusion. So looking back at this example we saw earlier where this person had 3 jobs, and I just spent like five minutes writing this up. But here's an example of how I would do this if I wanted to position myself as a freelancer or a consultant rather than saying I took a bunch of temporary positions. All right, so you can say I'm a freelancer and I developed KPIs and progress reports for this company. Oops, sorry, skipped ahead. And I reviewed insurance applications as the interim coordinator for this company. This is something that we see a lot with like executives where, you know, maybe you were a CFO for a long time and then, you know, you retired and you've been, you know, periodically helping out at companies, maybe friends or family, and you're sort of, you know, doing part-time or, you know, for a couple months you're filling in as CFO while they hire somebody new. These are really great things to explain as, you know, projects as a freelancer, things like that. And freelancing is so much more common now that that's sort of a very accepted explanation. And then when you get past the recruiter, then you can explain in greater detail when you're on the phone with someone or when you're in an interview the exact circumstances of how that happened and why. Because remember, we're just trying to make sure the resume gets us the interview. It doesn't exclude us from the process. And so as long as you're being accurate and not misleading about that, sometimes you can rewrite those types of short-term work experiences as if that was sort of exactly the intention that you were freelancing or filling in. Sometimes people have gaps on their resume of a year or more where you were not working. If you don't put months on your resume, it automatically eliminates a lot of gaps. Let's say I was unemployed for 4 months in 2014. If I say that my one job ended in February and my next job started in June, that raises questions, right? Why was I unemployed for 4 months? What was I doing during that time period? If instead of explicitly stating on my resume February and June, I just say 2014 for both end and start dates, that doesn't raise any questions immediately, right? So I always put years on my resume even though I personally don't have any gaps on my resume. I think it's just months. Like, what does that change for the recruiter? Nothing. It doesn't make any impact whatsoever. The only time it might matter is if you're filling out an application and they want to verify months of employment for some reason. But again, don't lie on that case, obviously, but don't offer unnecessary information on your resume if there's a chance it might hurt you, or even if there's a chance it won't, it's just unnecessary, right? If the gap is longer than 2 years, generally you do want to add some sort of short statement explaining what you were doing, and there's a lot of things that you can explain. I was traveling, I was doing volunteer work, I was, you know, caring for a relative, I took a sabbatical, I was doing some independent work, I was studying, things like that. Just one short statement on the resume, chronologically where that goes, and make sure that you focus in some way of explaining on how you've been keeping up with your skills in the interim. Because the main reason people are wary about hiring people who have gaps in their resume is they're worried they're out of date. So if you've made effort to stay up to date with the industry, if you know what's going on, you've been doing training or certifications, or if you've just even been doing something related to that part-time, or you've been volunteering for a nonprofit and that's somewhat related to what you used to do, make sure you explain that on your resume so it's obvious to them that, you know, you've been doing something to stay up to date and that you're going to be a good value to the organization. Or if you're in an industry where your skills never get out of date and that's not a concern, that's totally fine too. I would also suggest when you have a big gap on your resume, this is the time to include a brief objective statement at the top of your resume to explain. So as I said, there's always some exception to my general rules. This is where you do want to have that objective statement to say something like, after taking some time off to, raise a family, I'm returning to the workforce. I'd like to use my skills that I've developed, or, the education I've gained in the last 5 years and my volunteer experience in finance to return to a position as an accountant. And sometimes people are actually, they go out of their way to help people like that because they think that you're, going to be more hardworking because you're going to be more valuable, and you're also you're more grateful, and you're going to be more valuable to them because you're going to appreciate it more. You're going to try harder, things like that. And then I would say, this isn't specific to the resume, but you definitely need to network. There are some gatekeepers who are going to be anti-people who have been unemployed, or even if it was by choice, stay-at-home parents who are coming back to the workforce. But if you can get a connection directly to the hiring manager or create one, just reach out directly to the hiring manager through LinkedIn or through email, or if you can find somebody through the alumni network that might be able to make an introduction. Often that's the best way to get around those kinds of questions or things like that, because the recruiter's, again, looking for excuses to get somebody off the list, right? And if you can go around the recruiter, that will make it much easier to sort of explain that face-to-face, or, and again, in a cover letter, things like that. Another common question, accounting for having a minimal amount of experience. So we talked about Jane. I think that this is a great example of how to do this. Moving education up to the top of your resume, adding things like student organizations or activities, especially those where you had any leadership roles or sports, because people love sports on resumes. So those are good things to include if you're sort of short on things. And then make sure you think outside the box. Just because it wasn't work experience doesn't mean it's not relevant to the role you're applying for. Think about internships, work study, study abroad, technical things that you might have learned, any additional training or volunteering, things that will make you, again, stand out from the average person. And my last one on career changing, I think this is very similar to the gaps, is consider just explaining, why are you switching and what benefit do you add over somebody who might have that experience. If you're looking to go into consulting, maybe that benefit is, hey, I've been on the ground and I know what these companies are dealing with and I've learned a lot, and now I want to take that and help other companies do that. Or if you're switching, from law into teaching, maybe you can explain like, hey, I'm going to be able to bring my real world experience in the law to other people and really add some value there that maybe somebody else, some other teacher wouldn't be able to do. So try to think about, from their perspective, what's the benefit of you versus somebody else, because there is a benefit to hiring a non-traditional candidate. Feel free to cut out stuff that's not relevant, right? If you have certain jobs that are just totally irrelevant, you can just label it relevant work experience or relevant professional experience and focus on those things that are relevant. I would still avoid the functional resume. It's just very unfriendly for reading. But you can change what you focus on. Even if those accomplishments weren't the most important things about what you did at that time, are they the most relevant to the job you're trying to get? Focusing on those transferable skills and making sure you're using the right terminology to show that even though you're not in that space now, you do understand it, right? And what you have done to get into that space is you've done your research, you understand the space, maybe you've done some volunteer work or some education or training that will help you get into that new career, people you've talked to, things like that. Make sure it's obvious that you've done your homework and you're not just trying to switch on a whim. And again, networking to get your resume past those computer or recruiter gatekeepers is really one of the best things I can possibly recommend to you, because that's how people get most of their jobs nowadays, is networking. So we could do a whole other session on that, but the resume really fundamentally is not as important as people say it is, but you do need to make sure that you're sort of following these standards and what people are expecting if you want to get past that first line of recruiting and into the interview space where you can wow them with your experience and your skills and being a good speaker and all of those things. So, all right, I know we have some time left, and Maggie, I'm sure we've gotten some questions.
Yes, absolutely. We do have a few questions. So just to start out with, what is a good way to show position progression within a single company over 6 to 10 years or even more?
I think it depends on whether or not you want to include accomplishments at each of the jobs or if you only want to include accomplishments from some of the jobs. So if you want to include some from each, I would actually split them out as separate titles or sections underneath a master like company header. For example, sort of like this one, where you see here there's one company and two jobs with bullets. If you've been at a company for, let's say, 20 years and you've been promoted so many times that like it doesn't even matter what you did 20 years ago, you can just list out like 3 or 4 job titles right underneath the most recent job title, and then just focus the bullets on the most important things from those. Those are the two most common approaches I see. I would definitely make sure that if they all were within one company, that the company comes first, though, so it's clear that you were loyal and you were promoted within the company, because that's something that really matters to people.
Great, thank you. And what is the best way to incorporate quantified information when you haven't been a project manager or in a sales position, et cetera? How would you do this for positions in social services, community development, nonprofits, or for journalists, for example?
Yeah, so this is something people always try to stump me with. So things with community development or nonprofits, I think where you're looking at more of a social impact, I think it's still important, like the number of people that you were dealing with, for example. Or, you know, if you were, so for example, let's say you service like your company, your nonprofit organization service like 1,000 people a year. That is impressive to me, right? Whereas maybe I was a nonprofit, but we, you know, only service 20 people a year, just to give people a sense of scale. Or if you, you know, what was the impact on that organization? Did you have more staff? Were you able to, you know, stuff more boxes or bags, or rescue more cats or whatever? Those kinds of things. Like, there's always some way to quantify what you're doing to give a sense of scale. Or impact, like what did you fundamentally do that changed the organization? Sometimes it's something as simple as internal like processes. Like if you look at one of my very first resumes, it's about how I improved a process by 50%. Like I saved 50% time by making a template for something. Now, a template's not really that impressive if you think about it, but the fact that I was able to save myself 50% of the time, like that's impressive, and that's a number based on like working in Excel, right? There's always some way to do it. You just need to really try to explain, like, if somebody else had been in that position, what would have been different? I think if you ask yourself that question, sometimes you're able to see, you know, what impact you had more easily than if you were, you know, in a sales position where it is very quantifiable right from the start.
Great. And then in terms of freelancing, let's say you've spent the last 15 years or so freelancing. Is the best way to represent that time just to go through project by project?
Yeah, that's what I would do, because it's depending on how long you were freelancing, you probably have a lot of projects, and you're probably going to want to be selective about which ones you mention, just in order to not have excessive amounts of volume. So I would definitely, you know, make freelancing as a job for 10 years, and then within that have different projects that you did within that. And you may even have multiple projects for the same organization, and you still want to treat those as separate bullets, and that gives you more flexibility than if you treated each company within that as a separate job, and then you had much shorter time frames for each of those. I think that tends to not look as good on a resume.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we have another question. How should a person with a foreign name deal with name bias?
Oh man, that's a very tough question. I don't think there's anything that you can really do about it, to be honest. I think it just is what it is. I would probably, you know, make sure that my name wasn't as big on my resume, that other things that made me stand out were a little bit bigger, and I would probably, to be honest, try to get around. If I felt really strongly that that was an issue, I might consider in an objective statement stating something like native or fluent English speaker or something like that, if you think that that's a concern. that they might be concerned about your English, or if they're concerned about like if you're a U.S. citizen or something. I've seen people state that in the top, the objective, like I have a green card, or I'm a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, fluent in English and whatever other language. I think that's a good use of an objective statement, or profile, so to speak, if you're concerned that that's an issue. But I also think in some industries it doesn't matter anymore, especially if you're in tech. That's sort of expected foreign names at this point. So it kind of depends a little bit on that space. I wouldn't always feel the need to make excuses for that, because I think that also perpetuates the problem a little bit. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's great advice. And then just for a final question, in terms of including things that are not as quantifiable, let's say a testimonial from a former boss or a client, is there anything that you would recommend in terms of including those things on your resume? And then lastly, are there any web links, books, or other resources that we can direct attendees to who want a little bit more advice about this?
So I don't believe that testimonials belong in a resume. I think that testimonials are things that belong like on LinkedIn or in your references. And I think that on a resume, that's really not what it's for. I think if you have somebody that feels really strongly, and there's like one job you really want, and there's somebody that feels really strongly, they could reach out directly and do that. But I personally just don't think that's the place or the time for it. I mean, there's a section on LinkedIn for it, so put it there. But reference letters and things like that are just really not. They almost come off as you don't know how things work now, I think, to some extent, because their recruiters are just too busy to deal with that, and they're not really looking for extra reasons at this point. As far as resources, I mean, obviously the Alumni Career Network has great resources, and then places like the Ladder also have a bunch of research, Career Builder, things like that. They have a bunch of research they've done on resumes and things like that. I don't think they're as high quality as what you get through the Alumni Career Network personally, but you can definitely get them. They're free and fast to look around. Honestly, a lot of it is common sense, so I think that you guys can trust your own judgment. When you look at somebody else's resume, it's pretty easy to know whether it's good or not, and I think you can do the same thing at your resume if you're able to step back and just sort of look at it with a critical eye. So I have faith in you.
Great. Well, Kristen, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. We have a few other questions that we didn't quite get to, but maybe, Kristen, we can email those to you after we're wrapped up here today in case you have some thoughts on those. And I would like to thank everybody for joining us for today's resume workshop presentation. As a reminder, please watch your email for an invitation to take a survey. Your feedback is really crucial to helping us enhance our programming for UChicago alumni. So thanks again, and we hope to see you at our next alumni career webinar and on our website, careers.uchicagoalumni.org.
All right.
Thank you again, Kristen.